Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Fire Up. My name is Scott Morganroth, Motor City Madmouth. Pleased to be joined by George Icorn. George, well, here we are. We're going to fire it up. We have a lot of things on the backside, inside the pigskin just follows us. But, looking forward to the new format, new time frame with the two of us. You're on
Absolutely.
shows with me anyways. What's another one, right?
That's great. Yeah, looking forward to it. Let's get it rolling and fire it up, like you said, Scott.
Well, this, just so you know, folks, this show's about talking endurance motorsports. And why would I be talking about that? Well, with all due respect, and even though we're wearing a South Florida Tribune cap tonight, we'll be talking about the Rolex 24 as well as some of the other events I'm going to be covering on behalf of the South Florida Tribune. And last week I went out there and survived that 24-hour race, George, and it's something I'm very proud of, and probably the biggest event per se that I've really ever covered.
And I'm proud of you and Candy as well. You guys have done a terrific job covering motorsports. I know for many, many years, and it was a great opportunity. And you are definitely a survivor, to be able to cover that endurance race from the media side, especially.
Well, George, this doesn't get done unless I was able to cover two 12-hour Sebring races over at the old traditional Sebring track. And I want to thank Ken Breslauer for giving me the opportunity to do it. He had to break me a little bit, show me the ropes about endurance racing. And, the amazing part about endurance racing that few people realize is you have so many different manufacturers involved. Let me give you some basic statistics here, okay? For this particular race, you had 11 manufacturers, 234 drivers, 82 American, 24 British, 18 Italians, 11 French. And these people drive an average of about 4.5 hours. And what I was trying to tell you, George, there is so much money being thrown around. It's just, to me, surreal.
It is. It's an international event, and it always has been, along with obviously Formula One racing, NASCAR racing, especially. But it did. But this event, the 24 hours, the Rolex, has always been one of the most internationally attended and internationally supported, like you said, events. There's a lot of money at stake, and there's a lot of countries, and there's a lot of pride at stake with these guys and ladies as well that are in this racing.
Well, the way things are set up at Daytona was just unbelievable. With no disrespect to Sebring, it's an old Air Force base, is what it is. So consequently, I don't think the media facilities come anywhere close to what you have in Daytona. It's harder to find hotels in Sebring, whereas Daytona is a little bit easier. But I have nothing but the utmost. I'm proud of Sebring because I learned, and I learned a lot about what's like 12 hours. Now you take that and multiply it by two is 24, and then you have their pre-race stuff, which nowadays have become more and more better with it. You talk about 30 hours in a row up, and I stayed up 40 covering a race per se. And then you talk about the fact that I was up 40 hours in a row. So that to me was unreal. And when you're able to bring in drivers the way they do in the media center for the Daytona International Speedway was for real, surreal. So I'm going to give you a couple of highlights here. First of all, I
Sure.
had an opportunity to ask a couple of questions to NASCAR great Jimmie Johnson and Mr. Endurance Graham Goodwin, who's actually covered 89 24-hour races. What he
Wow.
done? 89.
Wow. That's unbelievable.
Right.
89 24-hour races. And you did a marvelous job sitting down and talking with him too. And I know that's available for some of our subscribers on YouTube. But that was a good one-on-one that you did with Graham. It's funny, Scott, because it reminds me of our friend Jerry Green going to 50, 54. Was it 54 or 56?
56.
56, Jerry Green, Super Bowls. But even that, God bless him, is a great feat. But man, oh man, this guy, Graham, oh, that's unbelievable.
Yeah, I actually met him at Sebring and got to know him. Then when I came across him at Daytona, it was unbelievable. So, it's just amazing how when you look at a race of this nature, I mean, I got to tell you, some of the things that I actually did to stay awake was I ended up writing a couple stories. Twitter got a workout because I was trying to catch up on key social media posts. And I kept walking outside day and night because it was interesting to see people sleeping on the benches. And in the morning, when the media center started filling up, then things got a little bit more lively. So, picture that.
That's amazing. It's amazing to me because I've covered different events before, as you know, and you have, and to see the media members, like you said, try to get some sleep or try to take a nap. You said on the benches. Was that, Scott, in the media center itself or outside the media center where they tried to catch some Z's?
Well, there were 2 or 3 people in the media center. Otherwise, many of them went to the hotels.
Oh, okay,
They went somewhere
okay.
else, or for that matter, they probably went to their cars. And I saw a lot of fans sleeping on benches. And I would actually walk out there a little bit because they have a nice TV screen actually out there where you could see the race at night. It was just so surreal. I didn't take any pictures. I had Candy Ebling do that. Although, should I go back there again, I will take my little digital camera anyhow. But we left that to Candy to do it. But it's just one of those types of things where when you talk about the nature of this race, for example, the Rolex 24 was so intriguing because you know what the prize is for all the drivers, don't you?
The Rolex watch.
That's it. How would you like to have a trophy which is a Rolex
Oh
watch?
my gosh, that's the number one name in watches. It has been for a long time. All due respect to its competitors, but yeah, I was going to ask you about that, Scott. Staying awake. I mean, you're not a coffee man, but I do know that you've got to probably have some sort of caffeine. What was your caffeine of choice, Scott?
Oh, George, I love that question. Well, Candy brought in 6 Diet Mountain Dews, so they're going to give you a hard time bringing that in. But only 6 carries you so far through the middle of the night. So I tell
Yeah,
you that Diet Coke was definitely the main drink. Oh yeah, you can rest assured of that, man.
yeah,
A lot of it.
yeah.
They had it in cans the first day, but then they ended up using the machines after that. And it's safe to say I probably burned off a lot of calories going back and forth to being able to go out there
Yeah.
and refill. It was unreal. And George, I can tell you right now, there were 32 nations, 6 to 7 continents, and the Wi-Fi was taxed. I did another radio appearance that lasted 5 or 10 minutes. Won't get into the specific nature of it. But how does anybody have any Wi-Fi connectivity when you have 32 nations, 6 to 7 continents?
Yeah.
It's hard to use the media
That was
room.
another thing I was going to ask you about, because there's so much information going out there, and like
Yeah,
you said, there's such a high concentration of volume and usage by all these reporters and teams that are visiting, and not to mention the fans. They want to use the Wi-Fi, and boy, I tell you, it had to be taxed to the max at Daytona Speedway.
yeah. And I should point out, Fire Up can be heard on iHeartRadio, Apple, Spotify, Google, wherever you get your podcast. So whether you're on, if you're watching this, listening to this nationally, well, feel free to check us out. Also, please hit the red subscribe button on South Florida YouTube. We're striving for 1,000 subscribers. We would kindly appreciate your support so we can get to that number and then some. So, this is one of those kind of things where, yeah, if you've ever been to Epcot Center, I've only been there once. This almost felt like the Epcot Center of racing. I just did.
Well, yeah, I bet, with all the different nationalities
Yeah,
represented and all the teams and all that. And Scott, remember when we had that Detroit Formula One on the streets of Detroit?
right.
With you remember that, and of course, me and my brother Martin would cover that for the Detroit Monitor locally, and that was another experience for me personally, only because we had that heavy foreign influence, obviously, with F1 racing. But I can only imagine the languages you heard and the types of people, all kinds of people from all over the world.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting as I look at the track configuration, the majority of this race is actually on the oval, but there's a certain part of the road course that actually comes off the infield where you can see a lot of the traditional road course riding. But this is one of the only places, I believe, where there's a huge, huge oval where you have the road course built in. Now, I know one of the big popular events is the 24 Hours at Le Mans. I know Jimmie Johnson did not race in this event, but he says that he has his sights set on the 24 Hours of Le Mans. And of course, you have Graham Goodwin about it. Graham was so funny because he said that he's never been to the Detroit Grand Prix, being an IMSA guy, but what do you want? The guy travels all over the world and he hasn't seen Detroit, but he was honest about it. This Graham is a pretty interesting guy.
Yeah,
And like
yeah.
you mentioned, George, for a lot of you folks that have an opportunity, please go ahead to the South Florida Tribune YouTube channel and go out there and take a look at the Jimmie Johnson interview, media availability. But more importantly, check out the Graham Goodwin interview. And I was asking Johnson in my two questions whether he felt like he's accomplished everything that he wanted to do and all that. And I would encourage you to check out. But Graham Goodwin's just unbelievable. This guy. You talk about he's like 58 years old, and I'm 60 years old for God's sakes, and being able to. But he gave me a lot of good pointers leading into the race. Get a lot of rest, concentrate on a regular driver, and all that. And now it was easier said than done concentrating on the driver. So I was kind of pulling for the drivers as they were coming in during the media availabilities. And as it turns out, Elio Castroneves was in this thing. And of course, Jimmie Johnson was there. And I was also amazed that Roger Penske and Chip Ganassi, had press conferences. We just missed those because we had just gotten in town a certain time. We weren't able to get to it on the Saturday side. But
I saw that. I saw that one clip on I believe it was on Twitter, and Chip sitting back there with Penske, and I think Andretti was in the photo too, and they had that panel discussion, for the media there. Roger's unbelievable, of course. Roger's done so much in the sport of racing, and I'm so glad that he's part of the Rolex as well. And I might want to ask you, Scott. Jimmie Johnson has accomplished so much in his career. But don't you find it interesting that, and also I find it interesting, and I wanted your opinion, the fact that he always is looking to expand his horizons to different parts of racing.
That's what amazes me about this guy. Tackled the Indy 500. If you ever wanted to find a guy who I view as a true racer, driver, whatever, Jimmie Johnson's it. But the one thing I noticed about motorsports drivers and people, they're some of the friendliest individuals you'll ever meet, ever. I mean, they're very hungry. They really, really want to promote their sport. Getting back re-involved last year, I can thank Russell Branham for helping me do that. But Russell credentialed me for the Talladega race last fall. And then we went on to the Miami Homestead, where I had an opportunity to drive a vehicle. And I'll tell you, you have to appreciate what it's like to drive these things, because it's just unbelievable.
Oh, yeah.
But the media availability, George, and what they allow you to put out there is just unreal. You want to talk about a sport that lets you, hey, do whatever the heck you want. We just want to get it out there any way we can. They're not unionized, by the way. I don't know if you knew that or not. It's all sponsor-related driven, which to me makes it just that much more surreal. It really is. And Jimmie Johnson, to me, is a driver and a racer all rolled in.
He is. He's remarkable. And you and I have seen guys cross over into other sports. But for him to come from NASCAR and go over to IndyCar, and now he's interested in a 24-hour endurance type of racing, it's great. It's incredible, but it's also great because he's showing he's a very, very, in which we already knew, multifaceted man and athlete at the same time. So that's really good to see. And like I said earlier about Roger Penske, that's one of the things I've always admired, Scott, about him. He actually drove car and loves driving, cars himself, race cars way back in the day, especially when he was younger. Roger Penske is a competitor.
Well, let me tell you, once upon a time, he did have Roger Penske Chevrolet in Southfield by Tel 12 Mall, and he actually sponsored a local baseball team. And when I had an opportunity one time to meet him, I met him one or two times, at MIS and some of the other tracks. I said, by the way, Roger, I just want to know that you did sponsor one of the baseball teams in my league. We had a nice chuckle out of the whole thing. I said, sorry, I wasn't rooting for you because I was really on the other team. And he was just laughing about it. He's got a good sense of humor. And the fact that he does own the Indianapolis Motor Speedway is even better, because it just shows you that he took it over from the George family, and he does whatever he has to do to make necessary improvements to bring in the updates that it certainly needs to be taken care of. Of course, we know he's had a hand in getting Super Bowls to Detroit as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to mention that, not only Detroit, but, the thing he did was when he had MIS, and he was one of the longtime owners of Michigan International Speedway, as in Brooklyn, the Irish Hills, and did a great job. Then, of course, the Super Bowl coming to Detroit at Ford Field, and, of course, the downtown street course, and what he's done to make sure that the Indy cars have a home in Detroit, first on the Island course at Belle Isle, and now everybody's excited. They're moving back downtown for this race in June of this year. No, Roger, has had so many accolades. The man's an unbelievable person and gentleman. The former President Trump gave him the highest award a civilian can get. Roger, he just loves it. His passion and his love for auto racing has just been off the top, off the charts. And I know there's many others, Chip Ganassi for one, and many others. But Roger is just an incredible guy, and he sure is a jewel that we have here in Metro Detroit, especially.
Well, Penske and Ganassi to me are the motorsports version of Duke, North Carolina, and Harwood, Michigan, and Ohio State on the football field. So
Yep.
you talk about just a one rivalry. Very few people aren't as aware of. But let me tell you, it's really big out there. So I do want to point out that just some big news that came across today is Candy Ebley and I will be covering the Daytona 500 next weekend.
Awesome.
Now, the only time I went to the Daytona 500 was when I went as a fan with my ex-wife, Susan, and we had a pretty good time there. And all three of the Hendricks cars ended up winning, with Jeff Gordon winning the whole thing. And with her being a Jeff Gordon fan, it was pretty cool. But this is going to be a different feeling, George, because now I'm right in the middle of it all, covering all the drivers there. And, as much as I enjoyed it as a fan, I'm really looking forward to being able to professionally work the event. It really is unbelievable.
Oh, it is, Scott. I'm very happy for you and for Mrs. Ebling to be able to cover that. That's a great thing. It's a Super Bowl. Like we talk about the Indy 500 as the Super Bowl of IndyCar, where you're going to the Super Bowl of NASCAR.
Yeah.
And a lot of people question it. Some people say, well, gee, why did they put well, it's not actually their first race. It's not, but some people still look at it as the first big race of the year. But that's got to be exciting. And of course, you're such a professional. Covering it as a journalist is going to be obviously one of the highlights I know for you and for Candy as well.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, face it, really, I was talking to one of my followers on Twitter, and, I've told him I've covered races in Phoenix, Homestead, now Talladega for that matter. And you and I obviously went to an Indy 500 as a fan, but we still went nonetheless. And I've been to many other tracks as well, but those are some of the main ones that stand out. But this is just going to be, to me, one of the most sensational feelings in the world, because it is the biggest race. And I'll tell you what happens with the Daytona 500 is the winning vehicle has to stay in their museum for 1 year. They do not get to put it back on the racetrack a week later. And, if you're an auto racing junkie and you want to see the winning vehicle, Daytona, that's just a first class setup. It really is.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And I didn't even know that, Scott. That's very interesting that the 1 year commitment to the winning car. Not the driver, but the winning car.
No. I follow you all along, but that's amazing. Hey, don't get me wrong. I love Indianapolis and the International Motor Speedway. It's a really huge place. They've done a lot of good things there. But the drive from Deerfield Beach, Florida to Indianapolis is a bit of a drive. I can make the Daytona drive in 3 to 4 hours in my sleep. And again, nowadays I never really get it anyway, so it doesn't make a lick of difference. But the Daytona 500, a lot of my people that I only open it up to my close friends realize that I have a motorsports passion about this sport, and why not? I mean, I just think if you're looking at a sport where there's an adrenaline rush, I don't even think baseball can give it to you. I don't think there's anything to give you an adrenaline rush and the need for speed. Do you?
No, I don't think so either. And especially when those the stands are full and the crowd is so large and huge, as you will see at the Daytona 500, and as you and I have seen at Indianapolis, it is an adrenaline rush. It's unbelievable. I mean, what these gentlemen and ladies do in motorsports is just, to me, incredible. And you can have that argument all day, Scott, about whether they're called athletes or not. I tend to think they are, because they're all in darn good shape. Maybe the old days, some of the stock car drivers were not in good shape, but these guys and ladies today now in motorsports are very much in shape and ready for the challenge. And that is a lot of driving, and it's a lot of energy, and it's just the communications they have with their teams and their spotters. I mean, you got to admit, Scott, that those teams, it's so expensive to put a team together in NASCAR, but man, oh man, I can see why.
Well, let me tell you, many years ago when I did an auto racing show for Weekly Wheels out in Arizona, former Detroit Lion Mark Carrier and I struck out a good relationship. had a good relationship. I asked him that very question. Do you think that auto racers should be considered athletes? He said no, because the car does the work and they don't have to run around the track. And you can make a good argument either way. And I think as I've gotten closer to the sport, and I realized how hard it was for me to get one of these vehicles as I've gotten a little older after a few years. You can make a case either way, but I'm not going to venture into that debate because it's so subjective, anyways.
It
But
is.
I saw Mark Carrier's point. It was pretty hard to argue it then. But getting one of those things, and then you talk about going in for a few hours. Now, if you take that 10 times over and talk about endurance racing, then you're talking about a different athlete animal anyway. So,
Oh yeah, for
we're not
sure.
talking. We're not talking about typical oval racing now. We're talking when you get to the 12 to 24-hour races, and Jimmie Johnson stated that he's looking forward to tackling that thing. That's a brutal race. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I might have to reconsider the fact that they are athletes, having done my 11 laps around Homestead Miami Speedway, going 147.54 miles with pictures and a certificate to show for it. I didn't have that luxury back then, but boy, it's just unbelievable. So, yeah, the Daytona 500, and I'm looking to build a good relationship with a lot of these people there, because what we like to do at the Trib is not only do we like to write about the story, but also incorporate the media availabilities as well as the podcasts in there. So we give our followers a real good opportunity to go out there and not only hear what they're saying, but read what we're writing about as well. And I think it's a pretty cool situation. So, folks, this is Fire Up. George Eichhorn and I are talking motorsports tonight, especially endurance motorsport, because that's what I got done with then. And of course, the Daytona 500 to me is like around 10 days away, a week from Sunday. But before I go any further, I do want to mention something that's dear to my heart. My father-in-law, Fred Ebling, had an 80-year endurance race that came to an end on February 5th, 2023. He died at the age of 80. Ironically, my father-in-law, Fred Ebling, died on my grandma Sophie's birthday, which is February 5th. She would have been 103 years old, and they both lived to 80. When you talk about the synergy of the 80, the dates is just too surreal. Now, here's where it gets interesting. When my mother-in-law died a few years ago, Candy Ebling had the choice to either go back for see her family on her birthday on December 3rd, or watch the Lions and the Green Bay Packers. And her family went out there and said, "Yeah, it's okay. We won't be any hard feelings." So the Lions lose to the Green Bay Packers on that Aaron Rodgers Hail Mary. When I told you down in the media room, I don't know why I have a feeling this thing's not over. And lo and behold, Aaron Rodgers and the Green Bay Packers gave Candy a spiritual victory at the expense of the Detroit Lions. And as much as it pained me to watch the Lions lose on that particular day, how do you not go ahead and feel for Candy anyways? And Barbara Kroll, who was also there with her as a friend watching it from the stands.
I'll never forget that day. That was incredible, and that showed a lot of courage by Candy, and I couldn't believe it either, Scott. For our listeners and viewers, Scott and I had to head down to the media center because you got to position yourself and be ready for post game interviews. So imagine this: all these media people, especially a lot of them, had watched the game in person, like he and I did, like you and I did, and then to see that unfold on television because we were stuck behind a bunch of guys wanting to see the game, and I said, no way, this isn't going to happen. I remember I kept telling you, Scott, they're not going to come back. There's nothing that Aaron Rodgers could do to save this game. Well, lo and behold, one of the classic Lion SOL performances of all time was that final play by Rodgers. But yeah, I'll never forget that. What courage again that Candy has shown, and extend my sympathy obviously to you and her and the entire family. I know your father-in-law loves, just like your own father, loved baseball, loves sports and football, and it's a tribute to him that it's coming at this time.
Yeah, I mean, amazingly enough, you remember all too well that. So I don't know. To me, that I had that real weird feeling that the Lions going to lose. And whoa, whoa, whoa! Speak of Candy Ebling, Hail Mary for Candy. That's exactly what I could say. Hail no for the Lions, but you were the real winner on that day, Candy. You really, really were.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, I remember telling you that. I just had a weird feeling. What really angers me about the whole thing, though, George, is how the Lions never got too many national TV appearances afterward, and they played in arguably one of the greatest games ever on Thursday night. Talk about the Rodney Dangerfield card. That was definitely it for sure. So,
Oh yeah, oh yeah, and of course this year too was a little bit different. The tables were turned, as we know. We weren't there in person to watch that game where the Lions did beat the Packers in the final game of the season.
no, we didn't, but it was still good to see them make a national television appearance at night. And
I gotta hand it to you and Jeremy on that one, boy. You guys were telling me that was being set up for national TV, and I kept telling you, oh no, they'll want the Giants, they'll want the Redskins, they'll want the Cowboys. I was wrong. I was wrong.
NBC was way too smart. They had an opportunity to put those teams on prime time and look at the game. You want to talk about the word geniuses? Hats off to NBC for going ahead with that football game. Hey, listen, when you see what Melissa Stark interviewing Dan Campbell, my gosh, that was just too surreal.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, Candy, you're welcome for the kind words. You're the biggest trooper and hero that I can say I have in my life. And, I realize that, we're leaving on Friday for Wisconsin. But in the meantime, we're just going to sit back and do what we got to do until we hit the road on Friday for sure. So, what a great show. Do a little bit of reminiscing, talking about some auto racing as well. And, I want to also send my best to all my members up in Wisconsin and Tennessee, the family members. When you talk about some of the greatest families to be associated with, to me, I am so proud of what I have with my in-laws. To me, they're A1 for sure. I've never seen such a great group of individuals. And what can I say? But the one thing I can say in hindsight is we were able to get there before my father-in-law died, despite 25 hours of straight driving for me under bad weather. So we can go down living with no regrets, knowing that we saw him the way we did, and everybody can feel more at ease with it. We all know we're here for a visit without a doubt, but
yeah, that was good that you guys got a chance to visit during the Christmas holidays, and that under some tough circumstances, like you said, with that storm roaring across the midsection of America. But yeah, there was a way you guys were gonna do it, and you did do it, and you accomplished that, and saw him for what turned out to be the final time. But it was good that you were there, obviously, and I'm glad you got there safely and back safely.
Well, I was joking around with Steph Harris, one of the media people there, and I showed her the story that I completed, and I wrote on there, and Mr. Endurance interviews Mr. Endurance on that story, which I'll be putting up on social media tomorrow. So, but when she saw that I drove around the country in his drive going over, Steph has a really good sense of humor. She really does. And hey, you know what? Any positive publicity that they're going to get it, they're always happy for it, especially when you have two endurance guys going at it the way we did. So with that said, what a show we had tonight. Our first crack at Fire Up. I expect us to do a whole lot more shows. A lot of these shows are going to be topic specific for the time being, unless we find a guest that's suitable for this particular format. So meanwhile, George, obviously, for a lot of you folks out there talking endurance motorsports, let me go over this again. That Fire Up can be heard on iHeartRadio, Apple, Spotify, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts. So, we have a lot of big audio providers that are going to back us, and there are probably a lot of other ones as well. So please hit the red subscribe button on YouTube, South Florida Tribune. We're striving for 1,000 subscribers. I should also point out that you can go to our website, www.southfloridatribune.com. Feel free to email us with any ideas or things like that at southfloridatribune@gmail.com. If you're watching us, you can find us on Twitter at Tribune South on Twitter. So, George, you have a book, right?
I do have a book, yes. And the book is called Detroit Sports Broadcasters on the Air. It's available for about a little less than $20, I think. Currently, there's a link on the South Florida Tribune website, which I'm a proud writer under the Motor City Tribune. And also, you can look, you'll find a great story and history of Detroit sports broadcasters. I wanted to mention, Scott, one of the fellas in here. Well, actually, there's two that when I think of motorsports in Detroit, I cannot help but think about two guys that you and I have known for a long time. The first being the late Vito LaPiccolo. And Vito,
Okay.
of course, was very proud to have his own motorsports radio show. And then the other one is a younger fellow named Chris McClure. And
Okay.
Chris, of course, Chris, as you remember, did a lot of sportscasting here in Detroit, and then went on and did racing coverage for a couple of the national networks. I've lost track of Chris. Somebody told me he lives somewhere in the middle part of Michigan. I don't know. Chris, if you're out there listening and watching, please get in touch with me or Scott, because we'd love to have you on. We'd love to talk to you, Chris, because you love motorsports and you still do, I'm sure. And the late Vito LaPiccolo, of course, Vito died several years ago, but my book is available, and there's a link to it on the South Florida Tribune, Motor City Tribune website. And Scott, you're in there, of course. You and I have been together for all these years, and you interviewed Jimmy Connors, I know, and Muhammad Ali. Pictures, some great pictures of you interviewing those two greats, along with your many, many interviews. I'm going to have to start calling you, Scott, the Barbara Walters of Detroit sports, because you have done so many one-on-ones and so many good interviews, I mean, over the years, and as you continue to do so, Scott. So thanks for letting me plug the book. I hope people can get a copy of it, because you'll certainly enjoy it.
Well, I mean, putting me in the class with Barbara Walters is something that I really take a lot of pride in. And since
Well,
you're bringing up the interview things, I'm glad you brought that up too, George. I should let people know that I have a show called No Limits. That'll be the show designated here on the network. That'll be designed mainly for a lot of the one-on-one interviews. You know, if you can only imagine what we've been through the last several weeks. We had 7 weeks in a row on the road on the weekend. Got to stay home last weekend, and now we find ourselves going up to Wisconsin the next week for Daytona, and all of a sudden spring training's going to hit. So if you're going to put me into classification Barbara Walters, I can't thank you enough. I think there's no question that when it comes to iconic individuals in our industry, she certainly is. And I'm sure there's a lot of other ones, but anybody that's ever followed Barbara Walters, to me, she's a jewel. And we've had a lot of great jewels uh, in this in this industry, I should point out. And,
oh,
you know, one
absolutely.
thing that we try to do here on South Florida Tribune Broadcasting Network is our plan really is to go out there and have as much versatility as we can. I know for now we're heavy on sports, but those are some things that I'm really working on to try to create a little bit more. And as year 2023 rolls on, we'll definitely be able to corner some ideas, some human interest stories, and we'll certainly get them out there. We recently had the opportunity yesterday to expand now to the Motor City Tribune Twitter page, South Florida Tribune Facebook page, as well as LinkedIn to go along with the other three that we already had. My personal page, South Florida Tribune, as well as our YouTube per se. So we got 6 going so far. But meanwhile, George, great first act. I'm glad we had a
Yep.
chance to do this. Look forward to developing Fire Up with the two of us and taking it to levels that we definitely feel that we're able to do. So
Absolutely.
any closing thoughts really quickly?
No, the only other closing thought was, I know I mentioned those two guys from Detroit, but you know, when I think of motorsports too, I think of the great voices that have done it, Scott, the Jim McKays and the Kenny Squires.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
you know, and of course we had this writer in Detroit, Joe Dowdell of the Detroit News, and Bob Latshaw. And it's really sad that even Detroit being the automotive, I guess my parting shot would be, and I don't mean it too negative, I don't want to end negative, but I wish that the Free Press and News would still cover racing full time somehow. I mean, I know I get it. You cover the MIS race, you cover the Grand Prix, but boy, oh boy, I miss the days when Joe Falls used to be at the Indy 500, or Charlie Vincent would cover the Daytona 500 down in Florida, where you're going. I miss those days. I long for those days from a local Detroit standpoint. I sure wish they would take that seriously to heart and put assigned reporters on the motorsports beat. That's why I'm so proud of you, Scott, and Candy in covering it, because we certainly need. I think there's a thirst for motorsports coverage, and especially the 24 hours of Rolex that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, you know what? I will say this before we go off air: the Daytona 500 is a dream. To me, the Rolex 24 was the biggest accomplishment I've had in my 43 years. Not discounting the Super Bowls or anything like that, George, but to be able to cover an event 30 hours in a row, to me, I just don't know if I can top it except by doing it again. So,
Yeah, that was
but you
great.
know, Joe Falls, Charlie Vincent, Vito Piccolo as well. Mike Joy's done a good job. And
Oh, yes.
I had a chance to meet Ken Squire over at MIS, and my times covering racing at MIS was just truly great, especially with you alongside of me, as you have all the time anyway. So I don't have a parting shot. All I'm going to say is, rest in peace, Fred Ebling, my father-in-law. I love you very much. You've definitely taught me to loosen up and definitely show me what the word laughter is, because if there's a guy that had a better sense of humor than him, find that one time. And I do want to close on this story here before we call it a night, because Inside the Pigskin is coming up very shortly. I'll never forget the time over in the Keys when we go on a glass boat bottom, and we get out there, a good time, all Candy and I and Fred. So then we finally get ready to go to Jimmie Johnson's restaurant over at, I think it's Key Largo. It's one of the Keys. And we had a 1 mile traffic jam that lasted an hour. And you want to talk a guy whose sense of humor was going 500 miles an hour. Yes, there is a pun intended here. If he didn't ramble off one-liners that quick, I would have had a broken wrist and broken hand. He was that unbelievable. This guy was always at the top of his game anyways with everything he did. And I always joked around about him. Listen, Pops, you had a lot of great one-liners, but you're the one who said, as if I needed any more doctor visits in the first place. This guy saved me from going to the emergency room because my hand hit steering wheel more times than not. And he just kept ramming and I kept laughing. He did a good job distracting me. And you know what? He's in a great place with my mother-in-law in heaven. So, like I said, looking forward to pay my respects up there with the family. But I certainly wanted to make sure there was an emphasis placed on him as well tonight, as I will mention on Inside the Pigskin, as well as some of the other shows I'll be on next days. But it had to start with you because you had a chance to meet him up in Milwaukee.
I sure did. Great man. Great. Yeah.
So meanwhile, one other note, Candy Ebling, I know you're tuning in. I want to thank you very much for what you do to the South Florida Tribune, putting all the content up there. And more importantly, okay, she's a mastermind behind getting these broadcasts up there and everything. So if she's definitely, to me, one of those types of individuals that keeps this all together, then it's unbelievable. It really, really is. So meanwhile, Candy, we love you very much. And you know what? I got news for you. A lot of good days are ahead of us. So on behalf of George Eichhorn, my name is Scott Morganroth. Thank you for joining us on this edition of Fire Up, and we will catch you the next time. Have a good night. Inside the Pigskin follows. Good night, everybody.
Good night.